Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, I am joined again with Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston, and Ruminations for our roundtable discussion. Today, we'll be expanding on our concept of problems of liberalism, primarily dealing with economic liberalism, otherwise known as neoliberalism. Uh, Neoliberalism, like other political terms like the alt-right or the alt-left or communist or fascist, can be maddeningly vague at times and often amounts to little more than a political swear word. But to the extent that neoliberalism means anything and is a meaningful concept, I'm going to use the Investopedia definition. Neoliberalism is a policy model bringing politics, social studies, and economics that seeks to transfer control of economic factors to the private sector from the public sector. It tends towards free market capitalism and away from government spending, regulation, and public ownership. Some of the policies that it tends to advocate: neoliberalism supports fiscal austerity, deregulation, free trade, privatization, and greatly reduced government spending. A certain Mises article entitled "Was Mises a Neoliberal?" cites a definition from David Harvey, which states an economy built on just-in-time production, the internationalization of capital, the deregulation of industry, insecure labor, and the entrepreneurial self. In the years since, these trends have only accelerated due to the improvements in and the spread of information technologies, but few call this post-Fordism any longer. They mostly call it neoliberalism. So I think those two definitions are as serviceable as any thus far and tend to avoid a lot of the loaded political opinions and jargon that the term has often meant. So now you mentioned it briefly last time, Keith, but could you elaborate a little more on the sort of intellectual history of neoliberalism?
Well, neoliberalism, properly understood, I think, starts to emerge in the mid-20th century. One thing that we have to remember is that classical liberalism was dominant in the Western world from roughly the late 18th century up through the early 19th century. And classical liberalism, very broadly, was the ideas of, rooted in the philosophy of thinkers like John Locke. But when it comes to economics, generally the idea that free trade, free enterprise, allowing commercial society to do its own thing and thrive. The idea that that was the best model of economics was fairly dominant up until the early to mid 20th century, from the late 18th century onward. Now, there were always exceptions to that. For example, if you go back and look at the actual economic policies that were practiced by the leading economic powers during that time period, and again, this is roughly the 19th century, most leading economic powers actually practiced mercantilism of some particular type. They didn't practice some kind of complete laissez-faire or anything even approaching that. So mercantilism was really the dominant economic model from that time period. The idea was you use domestic liberalism, free markets or whatever it would be called today, for the purpose of wealth development, and then you use protectionist trade policies for the purpose of building up national wealth. And this was more or less the model that virtually all early industrial powers used. The United States was a good example. The United States practiced a system that was devised by Henry Clay, an American statesman in the 19th century. And the Henry Clay's system amounted to this: domestic free enterprise and international protectionism. And there was a German economist, Friedrich List, that developed a similar model of economics. In fact, this point of view today in economic theory is actually called developmental economics. There's a whole school of economic theory that's built up around this called developmental economics. But that's really just another term for mercantilism. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, during the time of the worldwide depression, there was a widely perceived viewpoint, a widespread viewpoint that said that that classical liberalism had failed, that what was considered to be laissez-faire during that time period had actually failed, and it was necessary to move towards a more managed economy. I'm giving a really rough outline here. I mean, there's a lot of variables that feed into this historical trajectory. But around this time, you start to see the rise of Keynesian economics, and John Maynard Keynes was a British economist who believed that government should intervene in the economy for the purpose of maintaining economic stability. The two of the main things that Keynes was concerned about was maintaining low unemployment rates. In the worldwide depression of the 30s, virtually every country that was impacted by this experienced high unemployment rates. And that led to a lot of political instability as well. And the idea was to use government management of the economy as a means of keeping unemployment low. And the other one was inflation. The idea was you wanted to also balance inflation. Inflation had been a serious problem during the Depression as well. It was a problem in the United States. It was really a problem in some countries, Germany, for example, where you had runaway inflation. So the Keynesian model of economics was really the model for the New Deal that came about in the United States, and also the implementation of social democracy in the Western European countries during this time period. Even the totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy moved towards something of a Keynesian model of economics in terms of actual practice, whatever they may have called it. And then, of course, parallel to Keynesianism, you also had the rise of Leninism, which was the Soviet model, the idea of using the state to engage in direct central planning and of the economy, and essentially trying to eliminate market relations in favor of resource allocation based on rationing and distribution, ostensibly according to need. That was the communist model. So these 2 points of view by the mid 20th century were dominant worldwide. I mean, virtually all countries everywhere that were industrialized countries practiced one of these two, either the Leninist model or the Keynesian model. And then you started to see the rise in intellectual circles of Neo-Liberalism. And this starts with the idea that, well, maybe this Keynesian model isn't something we don't really want. Maybe it's too inefficient or impedes economic growth, or maybe just the wrong people are benefiting from it, or whatever. There are various reasons why this idea became commonplace. And also, it was also something of a response to the Soviet model, the idea that, well, a planned economy is perhaps not as efficient as its proponents claim that it is. So during the 1950s and 1960s, you start to see the rise of neoliberalism among professional economists, among policy wonk, think tank types, and all that kind of stuff. And then this becomes the basis for the neoliberal revolution that actually happened in politics in the late 1970s and early 80s, when you had people elected to offices like Ronald Reagan in the United States, and Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of England, and others. There was this move away from Keynesian economics towards what has come to be known as neoliberalism. And neoliberalism tends to be about breaking down trade barriers between nations and in favor of these international trade blocs. And that's how we got things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement in the United States, or something like the Schengen Zone in Europe, and all of these other things like that. It's also a system, you could say, of managed trade that takes place on an international level through institutions like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization. When it comes to international economic development, the idea is that the poorer nations, the underdeveloped or developing nations, should undertake programs of austerity, that the main thing they should do is, in terms of their own economies, is open their economies to international investment and international trade in that particular way. And then there's a general preference in, as you were saying earlier, Todd, there's a general preference in neoliberalism for the private sector. That's why today we see so-called conservatives saying, well, we want to privatize everything. And so that's a big part of this as well. Now, politically, it has political ramifications, because out of neoliberalism comes this thing that emerged at the end of the Cold War, which is the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus is the idea that was formulated in all the think tanks and all that in Washington, that the United States is going to more or less practice world hegemony, be a benevolent global hegemony, as Bill Kristol, the neocon, called it. But whether it's benevolent or not is a different question. But the idea was the United States was going to be essentially rule the world, and part of that was going to be to facilitate the spread of neoliberalism internationally and integrate the integrate international markets into this globalized economy that we have now. And all of these international trade blocs, international trade management organizations that have come about since then are a big part of that. And that's really where things stand now. I mean, that's still the paradigm we're in now, is neoliberalism.
All right, thank you, Keith. Some of the objections that I have to neoliberalism, we'll start with just-in-time production. Just-in-time production, as is defined by Investopedia, is a management strategy that aligns raw material orders from suppliers directly with production schedules. Companies employ the inventory strategy to increase efficiency and decrease waste by receiving goods only as they need them for the production process, which reduces inventory costs. This method requires producers to forecast demands accurately. So the obvious problem with just-in-time production is it is neither robust nor anti-fragile. So a system is robust if it can survive shocks to the system. A system is anti-fragile if it grows proportionately to the shocks. Shocks to the system would bring a just-in-time production chain to its knees, which leads to then the externality of the U.S. empire, because we have to make sure that all the production chains don't break down. And we have to make sure that they all work. So if one part of the world becomes destabilized or run by a rogue state that pulls out of the global economy, well, then we run the risk of pulling the string out of the production chains, which then leads to the whole system unraveling. So that's one problem with neoliberalism. The other one is human fungibility. Fungibility is the idea that for all practical purposes, two or more objects are identical, which in the case of humans is just obviously not the case. I mean, we all know people of different sexes or the same sex, which are different. Most obviously, men and women are not fungible in terms of strength. If you want to have coal miners, lumberjacks, crab fishermen, we know who you're going to hire. You're not going to hire women. And so humans are not really fungible. So it's based on just a false view of human biology. The other problem is they tend to argue that humans are utility calculators. They rationally choose to maximize their utility. Well, that's not and all self-evident. I mean, many people are addicted to drugs and alcohol. How does that maximize their utility? And which utility is being maximized? Is it bestial pleasures that Bentham advocated? Or is it sort of more sophisticated philosophic pleasures that Mill advocated? And if you're a Millian utilitarian, then people obviously don't maximize their utility. By the way, we look at most consumption patterns. Outsourcing industry for the sake of efficiency and lowering costs is a double-edged sword, because if you go to war and you can't produce the means of war, then an embargo could cripple you. Case in point, the Confederacy. The Confederacy could not produce the weapons of war. They had to import them from Britain. And when they got cut off with the Union blockade, they were done. That's why Israel in the 1980s shifted to its own domestic armaments production, because, you know, it wouldn't be uncommon for Israel to order a slew of Mirage jets from the French or M60 tanks from the Americans, and due to Arab pressure, we just canceled the deal. So there's a lot of security risks involved if you do that. And then lastly, free trade for all, irrespective of a nation's good behavior, is again problematic, because China is much more competitive than the United States in labor markets, precisely because it has no environmental or labor regulations, but the United States does. So one, it rewards bad actors for being bad actors and unfairly penalizes American workers for having, and American employers for actually, being respectful of environmental and labor externalities. So I think these, among many, are some of my objections to neoliberalism in practice. Swithun, is there anything you'd like to add or comment on?
Yeah, when it comes to neoliberalism, I think the definition you provided from Investopedia and Keith's genealogy don't necessarily match up particularly well. I think, as Keith described, really neoliberalism is just the current economic paradigm of the US and things like the EU. And despite its rhetoric with respect to free markets, etc., it's really, if you treat the Keynesian period as communism in the early years under Lenin, what we have now is effectively analogous to state-controlled capitalism of the new economic policy. Despite its lip service to free markets, free trade, etc., it is nothing of the sort in most cases. So free trade, say the World Trade Organization, is not really free trade in any way, shape, or form. As Keith mentioned, it's managed trade. The length and complexity of such free trade documents are astonishing. And the minute regulation that takes place under this really to increase barriers to entry and to further help large multinationals. And so also you have a tension because you have the economists who are associated with neoliberalism, probably most famously Milton Friedman, to some extent Hayek. They advocate policies which probably don't really get enacted in a particularly faithful way that they were suggested. Not that I'm a huge fan of Friedman. So there's that to note there. That said, with the current neoliberal paradigm, as you point out, they like deregulation of sorts, but they tend to have a very odd understanding of what deregulation is. So, for example, Margaret Thatcher is credited as deregulating the financial markets in the 1980s, which is true with respect to international currency exchange, if I remember correctly. But effectively, she replaced a regime of private regulation when it came to the stock market with a state regulation. So, because they claimed that it was anti-competitive, it's the idea that more rules are necessarily bad, which was never really the liberal economists' arguments. It was rather that voluntary rules were better than imposed ones. A similar case you have, which you probably may not be aware of, was the case of Jean-Marc Bosman, who was a Belgian footballer who took his club to court, the European Court of Justice, because at that time, even if your contract had ended, if another team wanted to purchase you, then because there's no franchises, you basically buy and sell players effectively. You would have to pay the club even if you're out of contract. Now, in principle, this could work under a complete voluntary system that you're part of the private organization, which is the National Football League, that soccer league for Americans, and you abide by those terms. But Jean-Marc Bosman took them to court and said, no, this is a restraint of trade and against free movement of labor. And he won, I think it was in 95. And then this completely changed the economics of football in the in Europe, because of this idea of deregulation, free movement, which was essentially the overriding of private voluntary relations with imposed ones from, in this case, a supranational organization called the EU. And then, of course, we get onto the whole banking, which is a central banking, which is a huge issue in fiat money as well. But that idea of deregulation and like efficiency really misunderstands why kind of markets work, which is why the absurdity of private prisons. It's like, that's privatization. Well, it's not, because the state is the customer. You're not going to get what a genuine private prison system would work. It's just mostly corruption and getting the government to be cheaper to imprison people. I mean, it's not really private in any genuine shape or form. So the odd focus on a certain precise type of efficiency and regulation aspect is one aspect. A couple of aspects I think are particularly damaging.
Okay. Right, Ruminations. Thoughts, insights?
Well, I agree with Swithun that it seems to me that the problem lies in the definition. And once you have a better understanding of the definition, you can come to see that some of the defects that are attributed to neoliberalism lie more in the neo aspect than in the liberalism aspect. And what I think it's important to point out is that the term neoliberalism, which goes back really to, I think, slightly before the 20th century, actually was used in a positive sense by Milton Friedman and maybe people more in the realm of F.A. Hayek to describe what was a desired third way between laissez-faire capitalism on the one hand and Keynesianism on the other hand. Now, when it finally came to the fore in the 1980s and in the late 70s and beyond that, it really carried with it that emphasis on not a revival of liberalism as such, but a kind of synthesis between liberalism and the established Keynesian paradigm, so that much of what had been built up was then integrated into neoliberalism, so that the welfare state remained, that insofar as they pursued things like free trade, it was done in a heavily institutionalized form, a heavily selective form where you would say have a trade deal with one nation, but not with another. And very often these trade deals would be lopsided, such as some of the deals that the US has had with Indochina. And so all of the defects of that you are attributing to neoliberalism in its more laissez-faire aspect, I think are things that are really due to its selective nature. So, for example, take this idea that that there are inconvenient entanglements with the production processes in other countries. Well, this is something which cannot be understood separate from the fact that they have selectively invested their outsourcing in particular nations in light of these selective free trade agreements. So there is not a universal system of deregulation. I would imagine that in a system of genuine free trade, where you had lower tariffs across the board, with the exception of maybe places that you were going to war with or places that were leveling tariffs against you, then there would be a greater degree of versatility as to how outsourcing could allocate itself. So in other words, what this institutionalized form of liberalism has done is it has specifically entangled Western, or let's take, for example, US interests in other specific nations without the kind of versatility that would be necessary for you to say to be able to quickly reinvest in other nations if you had to go to war with those nations. I also reject the idea that liberalism is only able to operate or presupposes necessarily the idea that human beings are inherently fungible. There's no reason that, after all, the idea of comparative advantage is based specifically on the idea that people have disparate talents, that they're not all completely the same, that they do indeed have different capacities, whether those are environmental or whether they're inherent. And so it would seem to me that the problem that you're identifying with neoliberalism is largely something that can be attributed to both the restrictions that it's retained and the restrictions that it's been implemented. Now, this is not to say that there aren't serious problems with neoliberalism. I think that there are. And one is that I think that this emphasis on economics and economic deregulation, but in a non-absolute sense, is usually used as a catalyst in order to import other ideas that they like. So, for example, with Margaret Thatcher, neoliberalism and economic liberalism was used as a kind of Trojan horse by which to infiltrate or by which to inject subtly certain Eurocentric preferences. And this is something that predates neoliberalism substantially. And it's a trick that's used time and time again. You see it in the formation of the early American Republic, where they have this problem where the states are issuing all kinds of paper money. They're inflating their currency. And the argument is that there needs to be a central bank and a central constitution in order to enforce hard money. But of course, this eventually ends up with the complete socialization of money and with the centralization of money in the hands of a common national unity. And I think that with the European Union and with things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, what the goal is to use the promise of economic liberalism in order to get nations to invest themselves in central organizations, which then, once they have consolidated their control over these nations to the effect that they no longer are nation states, that then they can begin to socialize these places. And this is a common thing, that liberalism is used as something to lure people in to centralized political bodies. And this is especially easy to do if you don't have a laissez-faire understanding of deregulation, because it makes things more flexible in terms of the rhetoric. So you can say, for example, it makes it easier to introduce ideas of say, anti-monopolistic practices. And also the focus on economics is also a very clever way to bypass social issues, so that you can push things like mass migration, homosexual marriage. Like the European Union, for example, has pushed places like Poland, for example, to want to embrace pro-abortion laws because they're under a common legal system. But this is something which is kind of can neatly be put to the side or covered for when one focuses or tends to focus on the economic issues. And that's really another danger of neoliberalism. Not only does this focus on kind of quasi-liberalization lure people into these centralized bodies, but it also serves to distract from social issues. And another thing, the final thing I really want to say in this round is basically that it also it does a lot to discredit liberalism or laissez-faire liberalism, because then you have people like Noam Chomsky who, looking at the defect, and people on the left like the Occupy Wall Street crowd, the Bernie Sanders type, who have this vague term called neoliberalism, which is basically all of this stuff like central banks, selective free trade deals, NAFTA, the European Union, and it's clear that these things are defective. But having a vague term like neoliberalism and having the neoliberals going around using free market rhetoric basically enables these people to equivocate by looking at it and saying, well, look what the free market has led to. Look at what liberalism has led to. It's led to a completely dysfunctional, cyclical economy. And so it really proves to be a frustration for people who are advocates of liberalism in the traditional sense, because it basically associates more pure liberal ideas with this kind of vague notion of international global liberalism, which basically makes classical liberal adherence easy lay for the people who then want to look and say, well, this is where economic freedom gets you. So I think that the real problems with neoliberalism lie more in those arenas and less in defects which are due to the free market system that they allegedly advocate.
Okay, Keith, some of your thoughts.
Well, I would agree with much of what has been said already. I would argue that liberalism as a body of pure theory of the kind that started to develop in the 18th century with Adam Smith and von Humboldt and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century and all of these other people, all of these conceptions of liberalism represent an idealized, intellectualized form of liberalism that is considerably far removed from what liberalism in practice has actually been. I think the actual political history and actual economic history demonstrates that while you had people who intellectually conceived of, well, this is the benefit of markets, and this is the benefit of trade, and this is the benefit of this or that action, in terms of monetary policy. What has actually been done in real life and real societies is that the theories of liberalism or the rhetoric of liberalism has always been appropriated by governments and by ruling classes when it was convenient, and then discarded when it was not convenient. If we look at the history of what is commonly called capitalism, for example, capitalism has always been what libertarians call crony capitalism, or what might be called state capitalism, or something of that nature. There's never been laissez-faire capitalism. I mean, the hardcore advocates of laissez-faire capitalism will be the first to tell you it's never really existed. What you instead have is you've always had this system of state capitalism, crony capitalism, mercantilism in all of the industrialized countries, going back to the Industrial Revolution and even before that. So liberal economic theory has always been there as a body of thought, but it's appropriated by the ruling class or the political class or the capitalist class or whatever, whenever it's convenient. And that still goes on today. When we hear politicians running for offices or espousing policy objectives saying, well, we're for free enterprise and free market. I mean, in the United States, we hear more of this than anywhere. We're for limited government and deregulation and low taxes. Well, all of that is very, very selective, and it's all very, often very insincere. If you look at what people who use that kind of rhetoric, that is representatives of the political class who actually use that kind of rhetoric, if you look at what they actually do in practice, what they put together is typically it's something where they're okay with deregulation if it benefits politically connected interests at a particular time. That's about as far as they take the deregulation thing. You have some politically, you have some kind of multinational corporation that doesn't want this or that trade restriction. Okay, they get that. But they also get a model of privatization. That's what Swithun was saying earlier, and that is it's not privatization at all. It's simply farming out state functions to some politically connected business organization, for which the state becomes a customer, and then there's a guaranteed market for that particular enterprise. The best example of that, obviously, is the American weapons industry. I mean, the American weapons industry is a collection of about, I think the military-industrial complex in the United States includes something like 100,000 actual organizations that are supposed to be private organizations, businesses of different types, and yet every one of them is essentially a state enterprise, or might as well be, because all of their business is dependent upon the state. Not only that, but even when it comes to foreign policy, you have countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia that are guaranteed export markets for American arms manufacturers, which are supposedly private businesses, but they have a guaranteed foreign export market that's underwritten by the American taxpayers. The American taxpayers give money to these foreign countries who buy weapons from the American arms manufacturers, right? And all of this is supposed to be liberalism or free trade or free enterprise or capitalism or whatever. So that, and if we trace it back far enough, we see that whatever we want to call it, capitalism or state capitalism, has always worked this way. It's always been this kind of system of state-run cronyism. It never had anything to do with laissez-faire in that sense. That's never existed. There's always been an appropriation of liberal theory and liberal rhetoric when it was convenient, but that's about as far as it's ever gone, and it's still like that. It's still like that. Again, if we look at what our American politicians who talk about that, in the era of Trump, they don't talk as much about it, but they used to talk about, every Republican politician was, oh, I'm for limited government, free markets, low taxes, free trade, yada, yada, yada. What they would actually do in power actually had nothing to do with that. For instance, at least until recently, the Republicans were less fiscally conservative when it came to government spending than the Democrats were. And that's, and when it comes to international issues, it's the same way. They want to have trade policies that are set up at an international level that protect everything from intellectual property to patent law to exclusive access to international markets in a way that restricts competition. So that's what this whole apparatus of neoliberalism has actually been in practice, whatever it may be in theory.
Mm-hmm. Now, I asked off air a friend who most of you already know, Logos. He's been on a few of my. He also goes by Media Mediator. He's been on a few of my streams last year. And he's had some criticisms of neoliberalism that I think bear repeating. And he says, one, corporate tax rates. He says neoliberalism is predicated on the idea that if you give corporations more deregulation and leeway for profits, you can somehow tax them later to ensure that the GDP gains get distributed to society. This has been shown to be false for several reasons. Corporate tax rates seem to have a downward trend, not an upward trend. This is because corporations usually use the gains to lobby governments for even more perks. Some of the deals for corporations, such as H-1Bs, mass immigration, etc., end up turning into voting blocks that vote even more mass immigration, making it hard to put the genie back into the bottle. 4, job training programs and other transfers don't seem to fully mitigate the problems that mass outsourcing cause communities. Suicide is on the rise, opioid use is on the rise. People do not want to feel beholden to the state for transfers. They want to feel personally responsible for their income and contribution to society. Even if you give them monetary transfers equivalent to what they lost, there's an irreducibly qualitative element of transfer that means a transfer isn't the right category of thing to make up what is lost. As an addendum, even if all this has miraculously worked itself out, there's one more problem recently discovered by economists called prospect theory. This suggests that people are hurt more by sudden losses than by benefiting by sudden gains. This is so basically the last part is if you lose more in a sudden loss and the gains later are not going to be a proportionate gain to the loss you had. So to those objections, I'll offer to you, Swithun, what do you have anything to add or comment on about those objections?
I think it's certainly true that the idea that somehow you can just compensate people monetarily if they've lost their job from outsourcing, etc., is at one level incredibly naive or just sinister, because it's obvious that people need to do something which has value and has worth, and just by giving people money, they're not going to see that. The problem was a few problems. I mean, with the outsourcing, I mean, one thing you have to take into account here with the neoliberal paradigm is the huge and vast infrastructure subsidies which are provided by the state. Huge highways. They also underwrite insurance contracts for international shipping, which would otherwise be significantly more expensive, because if a container ship went under and the insurer is liable, that would be money. But as present, they can, if that were to take place, they can devolve onto the taxpayer. A lot of these infrastructure projects are always underwritten by the taxpayer. We have an absurd one in England at present, which is politically controversial and hopefully will be binned. There's something called HS2, which is a high-speed rail link between London and Manchester. Manchester eventually, but Birmingham, which is sold on, oh, it's going to help Birmingham and Manchester, when will probably just help London even more, because London is massively subsidized effectively by government spending. So you have all these government subsidies, direct and indirect, to transportation, which make it significantly cheaper than would otherwise exist to outsource jobs, which otherwise would be dealt with more locally and possibly wouldn't even be outsourced. And then there's the whole, just America especially, more so here than here, the occupational licensing, which just makes it almost impossible in some cases to actually get and do a meaningful job without somehow violating some local state laws. The best example, I don't remember what state it's in, but there's one state in which in their prisons they train the inmates for jobs, because they're in blue collar jobs like plumbing, because you know they've been out to the workforce. They're generally between the ages of like 16 and 30, so they're going to get a job and be productive and don't turn to crime, which, you know, on certain levels makes sense. The problem is, in this state, one of the requirements of getting a license to legally operate as a plumber is that you don't have a criminal record. I mean, this is the extent to which the small man is trodden on by the federal and state governments, which really mean that you can't do anything and have much control over what you do or be independent. You're either just you're a cog in the machine of Walmart or any other big organization, and when somebody else in China or Thailand can do the same thing but cheaper than you, well, then you lose your job. So yeah, that's what I would have to say with respect to the labor aspect.
All right, right, Ruminations. Any thoughts on Logos's objections?
Well, I do. I mean, I think that you have to look at the context in which outsourcing has become a problem, which obviously it has. But the question is, why is the problem something that can't be adjusted for? Why is it that the kind of development of the economy, even taking into account interactions with other national economies, would seem to be not feasible? And I think it is largely because of what Swithun touched on, which is disparities in regulations in certain areas compared to other nations. That is, the comparative advantage equilibrium has been offset by the fact that things like safety regulations, labor regulations, minimum wage laws have become so cumbersome in places like the US that it becomes almost a matter of policy. That is, outsourcing almost becomes a matter of policy because obviously businesses are going to want to employ people in those nations that are less scrupulous about the state of the people that they're employing in factories and so on. And also there's the issue of things like corporate taxation. That also leads to companies not only outsourcing their labor, but indeed, in some cases, even outsourcing their headquarters. You have also problems with, well, let's say that there was some kind of compensatory mechanism in the free market that could offset the losses felt by outsourcing. Well, how is that supposed to operate if you can't hire 14-year-olds? How is that going to work if you have to get a license for someone to mow your lawn, or if you have to get insurance for it? I realize I'm being facetious there, but I think you get the thrust of what I'm getting at. Is that yes, I agree with these objections, and to be honest, I actually agree that tariffs may even be necessary in a kind of retaliationary sense or a kind of intermediary sense in order to offset these things. But the problem is that when you go to the tariff explanation or the tariff solution without explaining the mechanism that the tariff would be meant to address, then you make it sound as if the problem were simply the open trade in the first place and not all of these inequities that are being produced by regulation in relation to other nations. So that is, if you advocate the tariff, I think if you don't want it to be completely permanent and completely ideologically overbearing, then you will want it to be understood that any kind of restriction on trade to remedy outsourcing must be seen as a band-aid for something else and not as a positive good, as if tariffs were a panacea or part of the ideal economic system. And I think that I also am skeptical of the idea of being too cavalier about wanting to hang on to jobs, whether it's in the face of automation or outsourcing or what have you. Because while in the short run that may seem like a decent idea, like, well, we had these jobs and they're gone now and this whole town is desolate. I mean, it seems bad. But the question is, how happy are you going to be that you had those jobs in 100 years' time? Let's say all of the factory jobs in the US had been maintained, the steel industry maintained. Well, it's going to look pretty pathetic when those industries are still being propped up in 100 years' time, while the rest of the world is living in science fiction. And I will say, to address something that Keith had said about this laissez-faire idea being an ideal, much like all other systems are ideals, I don't really buy that objection that, well, since liberalism or laissez-faire has never existed, therefore what one is appealing to would be seen to be a kind of pie in the sky that's just out of touch with reality. Well, obviously it doesn't exist any more than any other pure system exists. Yes, we know communism has never existed, liberalism's never existed, nothing has ever existed. But the question is, which of these ideals do we want to define our trajectory? Which one, which system, which ideal leads to things being worse the closer one approaches to it, and which one, even if it can never be realized, is an approximation of how good things will become, or how much more tolerable they will become in proportion to how close one comes to it. So I think the question is not which system is achievable, it's the question of which system makes life more bearable the closer one approaches it, and which one makes life more unbearable the closer one approaches it. And what I'm getting at with what I was saying is that neoliberalism makes life less pleasant in proportion to its deviations from traditional liberalism. But insofar as neoliberalism is an approximation of the classical liberal ideal with respect to economics, not with respect to migration or things like that, but insofar as it is true to what was traditionally considered liberalism, I would believe that I would view it as having made life better in proportion to how close we have come to pursuing that ideal. So I think that there's a certain framework problem there. Those are my thoughts for the moment.
Okay, Keith, what are your thoughts?
Well, I generally agree with what Ruminations said, in the sense that we should have as the ideal whatever is going to make things better, not worse. I think that's certainly a common sense starting point. One thing I'd like to mention here is that I'm going to quote something that this is from an economist in Spain, from the University of Barcelona, who did some research on the economy of Nazi Germany, National Socialist Germany. And this is how they described it. It says, the Great Depression had spurred increased state ownership in most Western capitalist countries. This also took place in Germany during the last years of the Weimar Republic. But after the Nazis took power, industries were privatized en masse. Several banks, shipyards, railway lines, shipping lines, welfare organizations, and more were privatized. However, the privatization was applied within a framework of increasing control of the state over the whole economy through regulation and political interference. The Nazi government took the stance that enterprises should be in private hands wherever possible. However, state ownership was to be avoided unless it was absolutely necessary for rearmament or the war effort. Right? Well, that sounds a lot like what in America are called conservatives, or advocates of neoliberal economics. That is something where you ostensibly have a massive privatization approach, but in reality, all of that is submerged within this much larger state-controlled economic system. In National Socialist Germany, about 50% of the economy was nationalized. Just like in the United States today, the state consumes about 50% of GDP. And in Germany, the other half of the economy was heavily regulated, just like the aspect of the economy that's outside the state sector in the United States today is heavily regulated to the nth degree. And this is the norm. I mean, this isn't some kind of deviation. Most modern states of the type that we're familiar with, this is the economic model that they practice. They practice this kind of state capitalism where, yeah, you've got all these private profit-making firms and individuals, but all of this is submerged within this much, much larger state system. And if we want to go back and talk about laissez-faire or actual liberalism, now one of my favorite economists from the 19th century was Benjamin Tucker. And Benjamin Tucker wrote extensively about the ways in which the function of the state is to centralize control over wealth and power, or economic power. And he went down through the line through things like tariffs, through things like land monopoly, money monopolies, patent law, what we would today call intellectual property. All of these things are intended for the purpose of creating de facto monopolies, entry barriers, and things like that. Swithun's example of occupational licensing is an excellent one. He was talking about how the prisoners, I think that was in California, the example that Swithun was given. But in California, one thing they actually do is they use prisoners as firefighters. They actually train prisoners to be firefighters. And then they use them in real firefighting activity because wildfires are a problem in California. However, these professionally trained inmate firefighters can't get jobs as firefighters when they leave prison because you can't be a convicted felon or have a criminal record and be a firefighter. So that's just, and there are other examples of this as well. So that right there is how, if we want to call it neoliberalism or state capitalism or whatever, that's how it actually works. It's this kind of, I think as Swithun said earlier, a good analogy, a rough one, but an interesting one is to the new economic policy that Lenin implemented, which is basically, we're going to have markets, we're going to have trade, we're going to have profits and things like that, but it's all going to be subordinated to this much larger state system and subordinated to state interests. That's what the Chinese practice today. That's what the Vietnamese practice today. I suspect the Cubans and the North Koreans will move in that direction in the future. And increasingly, that's the model we have in the West as well.
All right. Well, we're nearing the end of the time, so we'll make some rooms for final statements. We'll start with you, Swithun.
Yes, I don't have a huge amount to add from what I've already mentioned, except probably that one thing that marks out, which I've mentioned slightly before, about the neoliberal paradigm, which was different to the Keynesian consensus between 45 and 79, is really the unleashing of an untrammeled fiat currency system. Now, I know that starts in the early 1970s with closing of the gold window by Nixon in 71. But you get into the 80s with the deregulations, inverted commas, which really propel the new sort of financial capitalism that we see from the 1980s onwards to a large extent. And a lot of the criticisms of the current economic order of being based around the finance industry, who previously provided finance to make things that people wanted, now just sort of make money in some sort of odd, weird way, which no one really understands. Well, some people do, but most people don't. And this as well, then, of course, back there also backs up state spending, because they can fund deficits that way, because they have a ready made market for their bonds, which could be sold and then propped up by the central banks, so all the commercial banks can buy them. And so you have this system of ever expanding national debts, especially after 2008. And this is, I would say, one of the main funding sources for the state powers we have at present, which is this sort of quote unquote deregulated banking system. A related point with that, after 2008, there was a guy in England called Dave somebody or other who tried to set up his own bank. And basically, he's had 2 years, he couldn't do it because it was basically impossible with the amount of regulation. He set up sort of a quasi bank. But in Britain, I think the newest banking license was given to an American banking organization. It was the first one they newly granted, like 165 years. This is the extent to which the cartelization of the finance system, which has been really big, really since the early 80s onwards, and really sort of finances the whole job and is the root of a lot of problems. So, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right, Ruminations.
Well, I'd like to end with a word about what I think is going to come of neoliberalism, and how I think it would be wise for people to address these concerns going forward. What I think has already started to happen and is going to continue happening is that neoliberalism, in the vague sense that we mean it, meaning a kind of mitigated corporate welfare state capitalism that's globalist and favors international institutions, but sort of in the aftermath of the whole 1980s neoliberal revolution, is that unlike in, say, the 2000 aughts, it is going to, I think, increasingly be something that's associated with the left. And you can see this with something like when there are all kinds of left-wing university students who in Great Britain go out in droves to protest Great Britain's departure from the European Union. Something utterly bizarre when you take into account what these people allegedly stand for, which is, localism and anti-capitalism and environmentalism and all of these things. And they basically are so conformist and so unimaginative that they've basically just gone with the winds and are now, without even knowing it, supporting the neoliberal project that they were railing against just a few years ago. So I think there's going to be less of this kind of Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders, Harry Corbyn idea of condemning, Noam Chomsky idea of condemning neoliberalism as something that's inherent to the right. I think that what's going to happen is it's going to become something that is ideologically integrated into this broader concept of globalism. I think that's going to continue. I think you're going to find the kind of the cultural left, even as they advocate socialism, are going to basically go along for the ride. For example, I said this to Todd once, that basically someone like Pope Francis would never really come out and actually actively disavow capitalism, because he's basically invested as a world leader in the neoliberal system. And this is going to, I think, play into the new divide, which, as Steve Bannon has predicted or observed, is between nationalism and populism on the one hand and globalism on the one hand, and neoliberalism is going to be associated with globalism, and that's going to lead to various qualitative developments in its character. It's going to continue to become more culturally left. It's going to become more amenable to various socialistic modifications. And so the real danger, I think, is that you might move towards a situation where you have the kind of anti-capitalist populist left on the one hand, and this kind of counterfeit liberalist hegemony in the form of the globalists in the European Union. Now, thankfully, there is wiggle room within populism, because populism tends to oscillate between free market economics and economic populism. But I have hope sometimes when I hear someone like Nigel Farage speaking, because he is able to communicate to a popular audience the message of, these people are not really free marketers. They're not really liberals in any genuine sense. And he basically did this in the speech that he gave after Trump's election, and said that basically these regulations that are common in the US and in Great Britain are basically meant to, like things like minimum wage laws are meant to shore up large corporations. So in order to avoid this outcome of having simply two competing forms of anti-liberalism going forward, I think that it would both be strategically beneficial and long-term beneficial for populists to take up that message, to take up the message of, these people are presenting themselves as advocates of economic freedom, and they are not, that their actions are not congruous with that claim. And if you come with us, the nationalists, the populists, the people who are in opposition to this international system, then we will be the actual advocates of deregulation and economic individualism. And so my advocacy, my final suggestion would be that populists try to make use of this inconsistency on the part of the neoliberals and basically start to integrate liberal talking points into their own rhetoric.
Okay, Keith.
Well, I do think the relationship between the left and neoliberalism is certainly an interesting one, because it's been interesting to see how easily neoliberalism has been able to co-opt the left. As Ruminations was saying, the left supposedly stands for anti-capitalism, socialism, anti-big money, and all of these kinds of things. And yet we see things like the left getting so upset over something like Brexit. I see that all the time. I see just on social media representatives of the left, people with often far left views, supposedly saying, "Oh, isn't this Brexit thing awful?" And I think that the reason for that is what is passed off as the left, at least, has undergone a significant transformation in recent decades, in that the left today really isn't about anti-capitalism or things like that. I mean, there may be some residual influence of that, but I think that the left today is essentially a cultural movement or a cultural tendency, in the sense that what really matters to them is the whole citizen of the world idea that comes out of the French Enlightenment. The idea of, well, what really matters is breaking down barriers between nations and ethnic groups and cultures and genders and all these other things. And so that, so this sort of Tower of Babel ideology, can't we all just be human, and these kinds of things. I think that's what really motivates much of left-wing thought today, because you see that that's what always gets the priority. So the criticisms that a lot of people from the left were bringing against Brexit was that, they weren't saying, "Oh, isn't this great that we gave the middle finger to this capitalist currency union," like an old-fashioned leftist would say. They would say, "Oh no, isn't this awful? Because these terrible backward populist people, they voted for Brexit because they want to curb immigration, and that interferes with the multiculturalism and being a citizen of the world," or whatever. And that is really, I think, the definitive aspect of the left today. And in fact, I've noticed that people on the left who take their anti-capitalism seriously, like a lot of the people who are the so-called tankies, that is, Marxists who really take Marxism seriously, a lot of those have actually started to adopt positions very, very similar to those of the populist right, in the sense that they see nation states as a barrier to the expansion of global capitalism and things like that. So that's interesting to see that develop, how the serious anti-capitalist left is taking this sort of an almost rightward sounding position on a lot of different economic issues and international issues. And as we go further along, I think that the cultural left will be increasingly co-opted to an even greater degree by neoliberalism, because neoliberalism fits the agenda of the cultural left perfectly. If all you care about is multiculturalism, being a citizen of the world, breaking down barriers between cultural groups and ethnic groups and gender groups and racial groups and religious groups, then what better way to do it with neoliberalism, where you dissolve all national borders, you encourage mass migration, you centralize control over social life in a way that imposes ostensibly progressive values on everyone everywhere through institutions like the EU. Right Ruminations was giving the example of the EU trying to force Poland to liberalize its abortion laws. Well, if that's really what you care about, if you're that kind of leftist, a hardline cultural leftist, then all of these neoliberal institutional arrangements work to your advantage. Why would you want to oppose that? Why would you want Poland to be an independent nation that can practice, Catholic traditionalism and ban abortion and gay marriage all they want? No, you don't want that if cultural leftism is your primary objective. So the two are really bending into each other to a great degree. We are seeing now the rise of these populist left figures like Corbyn and like Sanders, who do have remnants of the old-fashioned economic left. But even there, I have noticed even from those camps, you see a parallel emphasis on cultural leftism that's just as powerful as it is among neoliberal leftism. And the thing is, the overlords of neoliberalism will certainly be able to co-opt this very easily. Because it doesn't cost them anything. They can give the cultural left all the transgender restrooms they want, and all the abortion clinics they want, and all the gay marriage they want. That costs nothing. That doesn't involve any kind of redistribution of wealth or power from the ruling class in the same way that something like outright socialism would. So I think that's where things are going to go in the future, and we're going to increasingly see the blending of these two forces in the same way that we are now.
All right. Well, this is thanks for coming on, guys. This is a great discussion as usual. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.